Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Balancing Consumer Perspectives and Environmental Sustainability in the Adoption of CO2-Based Plastics. My name is Jason Partridge, and I'm the VP of Client Success at Lux Research. I'm also one of the co-founders over at Lux Motive-Based, and I'm going to be moderating today's session. Presenting today are my colleagues, Ari Van Berkel, SVP and Group Director, and Ujwal Arkal-Good, EVP and Group Director at Lux Research, and also my co-founder of Lux Motive-Based. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the question box on the screen, and time permitting, we will answer the questions that we can get to in the time permitted. But I don't want anybody to worry. If your question does not get answered, please don't hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com. That's questions@luxresearchinc.com, and somebody will reach out to you and we will respond. So at this point, I'm going to hand the microphone over to the people that are going to be running the presentation today, and let's jump right in.
Sounds good. Thank you, Jason. Hi, everybody, and welcome. So, balancing consumer perspectives and environmental sustainability in the adoption of CO2-based plastics. Well, that title is a mouthful, but there's a reason for it. And the reason is that as we develop new and novel materials and technologies, we have an inherent looming question before us. A lot of these new materials and technologies, like CO2-based plastics, inherently involve higher costs. And those costs have to ultimately transfer to the consumer. So the looming question before us is, what can we do to enhance consumer appeal for some of these new materials and technologies? And perhaps we need to approach this question as a two-parter. On one hand, the question of, will people even be willing to pay more to adopt a solution like CO2-based plastics? On the other hand, what can we do as an industry in order to make some of these solutions more desirable? I'm very excited for today's session because as I talk through the insights from a human-centric lens using our AI anthropology engine, I'm joined by Ari, who can provide the industry lens and the technological lens to help us sort of look at both sides of the equation to pinpoint where perhaps there is or isn't alignment, the way the industry is headed versus what the consumer really thinks about it. So I'm quite excited. We're going to make this a fairly conversational session. And Ari, if it's okay with you, I'm going to jump right in.
Of course. Let's go.
Let's go. So I think it's pretty clear to all of us here, it's not enough for us to just develop these new novel materials because, yes, we want to have a positive impact on the environment. But the reality is that pretty much every one of us has experienced this, no matter our role. There's a massive say-do gap when it comes to the consumer. Consumers love talking about how they want to make the right decisions. They want to make decisions that are better for the environment. Yet when the rubber hits the road and people realize at the point of purchase that they have to pay extra, sometimes even 50 cents extra for a product, they decide against it. And this is the fundamental challenge that all of us are facing. Doesn't matter whether we're in the consumer packaged goods industry or whether we're a materials manufacturer that supplies to a consumer packaged goods manufacturer. We're all facing this problem. And today we're going to examine this problem by specifically diving into the case of CO2-based plastics, because obviously it is a very interesting and novel technology. And by the way, the consumer is aware of this technology, but it is in very, very nascent stages for the consumer. So from the consumer's perspective. So I don't think that's a surprise to anybody here. For those of you, by the way, who have never attended one of our webinars, on the motive-based side, we would highly recommend revisiting one of our foundational webinars on what is anthropology. But just as a quick crash course, what you're looking at on the right of your screen is our maturity index, which is telling you how well the consumer understands the concept of CO2-based plastics, how well the consumer makes sense of that concept, of that idea. And as you can see, it is in very, very early nascent stages, but it is growing and it is developing, and it does have relevancy to a fairly reasonable size of audience. So there is opportunity here. Obviously, it's not overnight, but there is opportunity here. But there's a caveat to that opportunity. because turns out while consumers do believe that CO2-based plastics are more sustainable and do offer some very interesting opportunities, the consumer has oriented themselves towards looking at CO2-based plastics more so through the lens of certain types of plastic products, i.e. plastic products that usually tend to have a longer lifespan. Think of plastic containers that we use in our homes, for example, to store leftover food in our refrigerators, as an example. So let me start there and pause there. I'm just curious, Ari, to get your reaction to this, because it's fascinating to me that that's where the consumer's mind naturally goes when they think about CO2-based plastics, this notion of durable plastics or functional plastics.
Yeah, so in this case, what you clearly see is the notion of CO2-based plastics as a way to take CO2 out of the system and store it more or less permanently, or let's say as permanently as when you would be planting forests, for example. And I think that is one possible angle that the industry could use to introduce such plastics. But as you can also see from just this result of your research, that is a very complicated story as well. We've seen renewable fuels in the EU, where it is possible to create a renewable fuel from CO2, so-called e-fuels. But then you have to show with a life cycle analysis that you're reducing the CO2 footprint by at least 70% compared to the fossil alternative. And life cycle analyses are quite complicated, and they're very difficult to communicate concisely or with any type of clarity to a large audience. So here you can see maturity curve is at 3.5%. Probably the experts have a clear opinion already, but moving this over to broad acceptance, right, to your mainstream acceptance part of the curve, I think is going to be really challenging. And so selling CO2-based plastics just based on a reduction of CO2 emissions, I think is going to be very much an uphill battle.
Absolutely. And I think what we're going to see as we continue in this presentation is where there may be some better opportunities in this landscape. And Ari, to your point, in one of the previous webinars, we talk about how trends tend to evolve. And one of the things we see pretty much consistently is by the time an idea that is nascent evolves into the mainstream, it also simplifies a narrative. So to Ari's point, right now, it's in nascent stages, i.e. the people that are engaged in this culture are people who have at least some level of knowledge. And you'll see this in this analysis. They have at least enough knowledge to have an opinion on the matter, to be asking some quite interesting, and I would say some very good questions about what the value really is and where they might be able to adopt them in their lives. So you definitely see that, but what we'll also talk about as we go along is how we might see that progress into the mainstream and how we might see that narrative simplify as time goes on. But fundamentally, this is the beginning. So when we talk about CO2-based plastics, this is the starting point for the consumer, application into functional and durable plastic. So you might then ask, why? Why is that the case? How come people aren't saying, oh, apply this into the packaging for my toothpaste? Why are people talking about functional and durable plastics? And I think this is where there's some interesting outcomes and some interesting questions in particular that are coming from the consumer. And we're going to dig into this a little bit more. But the starting point for that is this desire to use new technologies in areas that are just more durable, that are more longer lasting. Because the ultimate big fear in the mind of the consumer is that image that every consumer has now seen of a beach washed up with plastic bottles, of a lakefront with plastic damage, or a stork whose beak is locked because it's got a piece of plastic stuck on its beak, and so on. So ultimately, this fear that we're going to go jump on a bandwagon and end up causing more pollution is very much at the heart of this desire for durability.
Yeah, I think so. This is an interesting point, and also so it was a bit unexpected for me to see that people associated with materials, for example, that can withstand harsh temperatures. Now, I can see that. I didn't see it coming, but I can see why people would think that, right? This really is still about, if you're gonna turn CO2 into plastics, you better make sure that it doesn't turn into CO2 again, at least not soon, right? So these plastics need to stick around for a while. And I think that's the sentiment. That's actually good news for people developing these materials, because it also means they can and should be aiming for smaller niche markets where they can develop specialties. And smaller markets is not a bad thing right now, because we don't capture so much CO2 anyway. So if you need only a little bit of CO2, that's great. And niche markets would allow you to get a higher added value, which would justify the development needs. And I think we'll get to that, but you were mentioning already plastic waste. I think to persuade people to buy CO2-based plastic materials, which are inevitably going to be more expensive than what we're used to today, to buy them for, let's say, more casual use, like packaging, for example. Mm-hmm. I think more is needed than just claimed climate benefits. There need to be additional benefits to really penetrate the market there, and we have to figure out, and we'll get to that, I think, what kind of additional benefits might be persuasive enough.
Exactly, and one of the first ones, and let's call it the biggest concern here for the consumer, is end-of-life management, and in particular, if you look at what people are talking about, and this is, again, all in the context of CO2-based plastics, there are three major themes that people talk about around end-of-life management. The first, obviously, is the most obvious one, which is, are we thinking about the proper management of plastic waste throughout its life cycle? And of course, they are curious about the fate of plastic made from captured CO2 once it does eventually end up into the waste stream. So, common questions relate to whether the fate of plastic made from captured CO2, is it any different from the fate of, let's say, virgin plastic? So these are questions that the consumer is asking. And then relatedly, you're also seeing questions that pertain to, obviously, durability, which we talked about, recyclability, and then number three, which I thought was very interesting, is biodegradability. The big question for the consumer being, hey, hang on a second, is it possible to create biodegradable plastics from captured CO2? I'm just curious to get your reaction to this, Ari, because I think what's interesting is the consumer trying to sort of problem solve or assuage their own sort of internal, the internal turmoil people themselves feel, or the stress people themselves feel when they look at some of these new emerging trends.
Yeah, I think that so there are two types of thinking here that you can see, right? And I don't know if you recall back in the day when people were talking about cradle to cradle, right? And I think the term has gone out of use a little bit, but the cradle to cradle thinking differentiated between two cycles, the technical cycle and the natural cycle. And basically here you can see that people are wondering about the technical cycle. We should be able to recycle plastics and should prevent them from entering into the environment. Or, and that's your point number three, we should somehow make plastics compatible with the natural cycle. Now, not too sure if they're mutually exclusive, but I think those are two directions that are interesting for the industry to explore and to explain properly. But the driver behind, of course, is a big concern, and we've seen that, and we've seen governments already crack down on single-use plastics, for example. It's a big concern about too much plastic ending up in our environment, in our food chain, in all of the ecosystems that we rely on, even on places like Antarctica, where we're finding waste plastic that shouldn't be there in the first place. So I think that concern is only going to grow. And what you can see here is it's creating an opportunity for CO2-based plastics if you can somehow make the argument that while making plastic out of CO2, which is more expensive, it also enables you as an industry to make plastics easier to recycle or better to recycle or more compatible with the natural cycle.
Right, and you know, interestingly enough, in the motive-based technology, we can see who the protagonists are and we can see who the antagonists are. So in the context of CO2-based plastics, we can see the push in the positive direction is this whole area of functional and durable plastics. The pull, the barrier, is exactly this fear that we're just going to get greenwashed. And I'm going to say again, and I'm saying that again because from the consumer lens, they feel like they have been greenwashed again and again and again in the industry. And in particular, the way consumer packaged goods have gone to market historically with various better for the environment claims have only exacerbated this problem. So this is the biggest barrier. People just don't want to, I think it's a very human need. People don't want to feel like they've been taken advantage of, or they don't want to feel stupid at the end of the day when they make some of these decisions. And that's driving this worry around end of life, this worry around, okay, what happens when, to your point, Ari, that plastic becomes CO2 again? And what can we do in managing the end of life, or what can we do in potentially improving the next round of that cycle?
Yeah, and I think we see a little bit the same argument around CO2 capture and storage, or CO2 capture and sequestration. Right. One of the arguments there is that we shouldn't be doing that because it allows the industry to continue to use fossil resources with all of the other downsides to using fossil resources other than the climate change. It allows the industry to just perpetuate that practice. And that in itself is a bad thing, which is not something that you calculate, I'd say. So, right, if you look at it from an engineering perspective, you will say, well, what's wrong with that, right? If we identified the problem, was the climate, we found an engineering solution to it, it's capture and sequestration, done. But there are principles behind, it seems. And we've seen this before. If you remember Brent Spar, which is the oil platform that Shell wanted to decommission back in 1995, Shell proved that, right, in an engineering fashion, that the safest, the smallest risk to the environment was to sink the platform into a deep part of the ocean. And then the world revolted against that and said, you just don't do that. We don't care if you show that it's safer. You just don't do that. That's littering. You don't do that kind of thing. You have to solve it properly, whatever properly means. And in the end, Shell decommissioned it in one of the Norwegian fjords, taking great care not to create accidental spills and pollution and all that. This is the same thing. There are bigger principles. You just don't spread plastic all around, right? Even if it's CO2-based plastic or what have you. So that there are, aside from the engineering arguments, there are principles that companies should be aware of. that may be very implicit in many cases.
Now, we talked a little bit about what the push and pull is. Let's get deeper into some of the key questions that consumers are asking. And I think that there's some pretty smart questions here, and it just shows the level of knowledge that's starting to build among consumers around some of these solutions. So one of the biggest questions is it better feedstock? Consumers comparing the sustainability benefits of, for example, using recycled CO2 versus, let's say, bioplastics or biomass. So this is an interesting question to me, and Ari, I would love your perspective on this. So what I thought I'd do is pull up sort of the three major things people are talking about around this broader theme of better feedstock, and just do a quick summary of them. And I'd love your reaction to this, because, you know, obviously we can see the consumers asking questions about, you know, is bioplastics better or not? There's definitely some level of awareness and knowledge about energy utilization, land use, water use in the process, and I guess even the production of greenhouse gas emissions in the process. There's also, of course, you know, very interesting questions about performance and safety of CO2-based plastics as well. That's coming in here. I was quite surprised about the level of detail that the consumer was going into here. I'm just curious to get your reaction on this.
Yeah, I think instinctively, many people recognize that there's a decision to be made, but it's not very clear what kind of decision it is and what the arguments are. And that's, I think that's the debate, but it's going to be a very opaque, very convoluted debate in that sense. So right. If you rely on biomass, you're basically tying human civilization back into the natural cycle, right? You're relying on plants growing, and that will limit and determine how much feedstock you have to create whatever you want out of it. If you're going for CO2-based plastics, it's a do-it-yourself, right? You say, well, whatever that photosynthesis thing is that nature has organized, fine, we'll use it for food or something, but we can do this ourselves. We don't need plants to photosynthesize CO2. We will fix it ourselves. That's a pretty fundamental decision to take, right? Do you tie yourself back into nature, or do you organize human society next to nature? And when I mentioned principles before, there are the engineering arguments. You can calculate and you can show which option is better under which circumstances, and we have to do that. But you should be aware that there's also a principle at stake, which is, are we romantically relying on nature? To a certain right. extent, romantically, it could also just be a principled choice. Or are we venturing out as humanity to Mars, to the moon, or to some technology that decouples us from nature? And I think that's the implicit fear some people have. If we decouple more from nature, then nature might become more of a theme park and less of a necessity as well. So be aware of the depth of this debate. It looks innocent at the surface, but I think there's a lot below right. for industry to be aware of.
That's a great point. And I think anthropologically, just reflecting on some of these outcomes from the consumer research, the one takeaway for me, and I think for our audience, is that just because it's derived from CO2, and seemingly is arguably perhaps an easier story to tell. It's definitely easier to explain to, in layman's terms, to a consumer how you can extract CO2, or the fact that something is made from CO2 extracted in the atmosphere. And for a layman consumer to take that and go, hey, I can see that of being value because we're producing a lot of emissions. And I can see that as being quite valuable to us. I think the takeaway for me, just anthropologically, is that isn't enough. Just because this is derived from CO2 does not automatically make this more attractive to the consumer. I think that's a big aha for me, in the sense that the consumer is still evaluating this against other options, and there is no singular winner. And we've seen this in many other industries, when, for example, in the food industry, when sugar replacements and more natural sugar started to come to fruition and were easily accessible, everybody thought, for example, high fructose corn syrup will disappear. It did not disappear. In the same way, I think it would be foolish of us to say, some of these new novel solutions will immediately take the world by storm because they're so exciting. I think what this is showing us is not exactly. The consumer is smarter than we might sometimes give them credit for, and that there's an evaluation process happening whether we like it or not. And it's more of a case-by-case basis based on how it's applied and ultimately shows up in the hands of the consumer.
And that means you need a bigger vision as a company. You need to show essentially what your vision for the future of the world is. And when you come to think of it, other major innovations, like, for example, the mass introduction of plastics back in the 1960s, 1970s, before that we didn't use plastic on a massive scale, that also came with a bigger vision. For example, plastics are going to help you keep your food fresh, which led to Tupperware, for example, right? But Tupperware was not like, the vision wasn't, we'll sell you loads of plastic things. The vision was, we'll help you keep your food fresh. So what is CO2 plastics going to, how are they going to improve the world? And that the argument that we're just gonna reduce climate change or avert climate change is not enough, because there's not nearly enough plastics to justify that claim. And also, for that to be true, you need the plastics to be durable, and we just talked about that. So we need additional benefits. We need a vision about how this is going to improve the world.
Absolutely, and I think it's the perfect segue to say, look, simply put, what does the consumer want? How are they evaluating this? It's not very complicated. The consumer wants more functional, durable solutions. They want to feel more in sync with nature, and they want to feel like they're gradually leading a healthier life. Some of these basic constructs are not going anywhere. The consumer is just navigating the complexity of the world around them in order to try to check some of these boxes in their lives. And I think this is where, exactly to your point, Ari, there is a need for a longer vision, and there is a need for us to examine some of these new novel solutions through a broader perspective. And that's why I just pulled up our key takeaways, and perhaps I'll hand the microphone to you, if you will. Just curious to hear some final thoughts from you in terms of what you feel the industry should really take away, and I'd love to sort of add to that just through the human-centric lens.
So yeah, what it tells me is the industry needs to go on the offensive, right? If you look at the plastics industry, it's been very defensive so far. It's relying on the fossil supply chain. That's not immensely popular at the moment. It's creating issues with single-use plastics, and single-use plastics are being banned. So the industry is right now trying to explain how it made tremendous achievements, and it did, right? The industry is not wrong in telling that. With plastics, plastics are a very important part of our lives and have made tremendous improvements to our quality of life. But that defense is not enough. That is not going to help transform the industry. So we need an offensive, and the list you showed is, I think, a perfect recipe, right? How are we going to align plastics more with nature? How are we going to create healthier lives for people? For example, make recycling so much more simpler by introducing new plastics. how are we going to make plastics even more functional than they are? For example, where plastics could start indicating that the food inside is no longer usable or something like that. So these are pretty strong indicators to what should be developed. And I think really taking a much more assertive approach by the industry and saying, look, we got you so far, we will get you to the next stage. Here's the cool new products we're developing, and we need CO2 as a food feedstock to help us do that.
Yeah,
is a much more fruitful approach.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. And you know, just from a human-centric lens, I think the most important thing that I would like the audience to take away is that sustainability isn't enough of a broader banner, especially when you're developing new novel materials. Exactly to your point, Ari, the question we have to ask is, how will this help solve some of the innate problems consumers have? So for example, let's say there's an emerging concern, and this is actually the case, emerging concern around preserving natural skincare, personal care products. If plastics can somehow play a role in helping in that arena, now you're creating a value add with a new novel material. I think this is my biggest takeaway, is that it's not enough for us to say this is more sustainable. If we want adoption from the consumer, if we want the consumer to be willing to pay more for it, we have to give them a secure benefit on the other end. And we have to make sure, exactly to your point, Ari, we have to make sure that it doesn't take away from any of the other sort of baseline requirements consumers have, i.e., it shouldn't make them feel like they're being greenwashed, shouldn't make them feel like they're somehow ultimately polluting more just by jumping on another bandwagon. So it is complex. We can't solve, there is no silver bullet. We cannot solve this problem by just saying this is the solution to all. It is one among many solutions, but we have to be able to apply a broader vision. We have to be able to go on an offensive, to your point, Ari. And we cannot think of these as technology solutions. We have to think of these as broader platform solutions that we're bringing to life. And I think ultimately that's the one thing we'd like to leave you with.
Thank you so much, Ujwal and Ari. That was really, really, really great. We are going to take a few questions. There was a lot of engagement, and we've been getting quite a few questions, so I don't think we're going to get through all of them. If anybody, again, doesn't have their question answered, please remember that you can email us or somebody will reach out. You can also type your question into the question box. And again, if we don't get to it, then somebody from Lux will definitely reach out after the webinar. It's hard to choose from the questions that came in. So let me just do my best here. Ari, I had a really quick question from someone. When you were talking about kind of the life cycle narratives and how there's like complexity in them and it's difficult to get the consumer to really kind of engage around that, can you think of any examples where that life cycle narrative was used properly? Or if not, what is the alternative in order to basically bring consumers on board as they're starting to think about kind of some of these applications?
Right. So if you've ever done a life cycle analysis, you know that you'll be drowning in data. That's the first thing that happens. So that's extremely hard to communicate. Right. I think a good example is what Covestro has done with CO2-based plastic, where they launched this CO2 Dreams site, which had a very simple story. We have a safe, good material for your mattress, and it's produced from CO2. So you're getting a good experience, you're getting a quality mattress. And by buying the quality mattress, you're also limiting climate change. I think the latter doesn't really stand up to scrutiny because there's not so much CO2 in the mattress. So you either have to buy an extremely big mattress, like covering your entire house, or you'll have to understand that your contribution to limiting climate change is very limited. But when you do a life cycle analysis, you have to do your homework behind. You have to be able to back it up. But at the end of the day, you need a very simple narrative about the benefits of this material. And please don't show us all of the graphs and all of the assumptions and all of the numbers that went into the LCA, which I think most of the LCA stories tend up to be just too complicated. Too many steps to reach the benefit.
And I think if I can just add to that, Jason, I think even on the consumer side, we are starting to see examples of the life cycle play out in terms of people's actual experience. Great example is there are a couple of retailers now that will allow you to bring in your old pair of jeans, right, and donate them. And then when you're buying a new pair of jeans from them, you will know that the pair of jeans is made completely from recycled denim. It's not exactly a full life cycle analysis that is understood by the consumer, but enough in the sense that I've gone through the act of giving my denim and I'm now picking up denim that says it's made from denim that was recycled. So I think we're starting to see some of those narratives start to play out. I think we're starting to see, more and more legislation in particular. And Ari, you probably have some thoughts on this as well. Certainly I think, European countries, countries like Canada are a little bit further along in terms of legislation than, let's say, the US perhaps is in terms of basic household recycling and biodegradability and so on and so forth. But as that legislation comes in, I think it also forces the consumer to start to think a little bit more about what they're doing with, for example, household waste. And I think these are all instances where we are innately, perhaps even without realizing it, developing more knowledge about our own practices as consumers, as human beings.
Yeah, that's very true. And we've done some work in the past about for prospective LCAs. So, and that's not to get back to making the analysis even more complicated, but there are certain developments that are clearly a step in the right direction, even though they may not be immediately beneficial in the current context. Right. We had this discussion about biofuels. People were arguing biofuels don't really contribute that much because to grow biofuels, you need fertilizer and you need agricultural equipment and all that. So even the biomass that goes into biofuels has a considerable fossil CO2 footprint. While that's true, anyone can come up with the idea that producing fuels from agricultural waste is progress compared to producing fuels from crude oil. So it's a step in the right direction. And yes, the entire context needs to change as well to really reap all the benefits. But do we not want to take the step in the right direction because we think the context isn't right yet? Then nothing ever moves, right? So if things are a step in the right direction intuitively, just communicate that and still do your homework, right? You need to know what else needs to change in order to really get all the benefits and all that. But sometimes it's pretty simple because it's pretty intuitive to people that there is a clear benefit.
That's great. I think we've only got time for one more question because it's a doozy, but it's an important one. One of the comments that came up as you two gentlemen were presenting was the interest in that, even though kind of when you think about the context of trying to come up with alternatives to, turning CO2 into plastic, which is that positive, how can we kind of make this improvement? When we look at it from a consumer standpoint, there is this underlying doubt, which you ... linked to this notion of, am I going to be greenwashed again? The question is, what considerations need to be taken about kind of the whole notion of trust in who is actually doing the work, trust in the company, trust in the corporation, trust in the initiative. And Ujwal, maybe you can talk a little bit about kind of extrapolating up to kind of that higher order kind of question of what will how can we work to help a company build that trust?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick it off, and obviously eager to hear your thoughts on this as well, Ari. You know, the trust issue is obviously great question, by the way. It is the subtext behind fear of being greenwashed, right? That's the subtext is who do I trust? How can I trust? You know, part of the trust comes, and we've seen this time and time again, legislation definitely helps. Especially once legislation is implemented and it changes human behavior, it definitely helps build trust. But in the short term, you know, overall, in particular, trust for corporations has not improved. If you look at the last decade, if anything, we've gone in the opposite direction. So, you know, the importance of third-party certifications, you know, third-party validation is absolutely critical from a consumer perspective. And by the way, we're not just seeing this in sustainable materials and alternatives. We're also seeing this in the entire movement towards, you know, naturals and, you know, safer for our health and so on and so forth. So this is not relegated just to the sustainability side or the sustainability equation, but, you know, trust is fundamental, and it is definitely in a state of being broken. So, you know, whatever strategies are considered, it is an important part of how you can take your solutions to market 100%.
Yeah, I think so. Trust is about motives or about the perception of motives. So when Shell argued and showed all their engineering calculations that for Brent Spar it was better to sink it to a deep part of the ocean, the people went, yeah, obviously that would be the outcome, right? You did the analysis, this is the most convenient outcome for you, it's probably the cheapest, so yeah, duh. So the motive, the perceived motive, was not doing good for the environment. The perceived motive was, how do we get rid of this thing at the lowest possible cost? And it's not unreasonable to think that that was at least a part of the motive. So if an undesirable outcome is conveniently well aligned with a perceived motive of the company, you will never get trust. Right? People won't trust your results. And the only way to change that, I think, is to be very consistent. If your stated motive is to improve people's life or to bring them more in sync with nature or any other thing of that list, you have to consistently show that you're working in that direction. And yes, at the same time, you're trying to make money. And you'll be hard pressed to find people who would argue that that's bad. But it has to be consistent. So your company behavior has to be consistently working towards, even if sometimes it will cost money.
Yeah.
And that's how you pay for trust. Yeah. And if you don't want to pay for trust, then you probably won't get it.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very, very much for today. I think the thing that was most exciting for me was how complementary having both of you speak to this perspective was. Just using what you just said, Ari, as that segue, you know, the ability to understand, you know, kind of from a consumer point of view, what will drive trust, and then matching it to what an organization or the industry can achieve, and almost kind of creating that connective tissue between the two in order to kind of propel better decisions by people, better decisions by organizations, and just better for, you know, kind of people in general is such an exciting thing that I think that we touched on today. I do know that there were some other questions around kind of, you know, how did we look at size and culture? Please, if anybody has any follow-up questions in regards to how some of the insights were generated, we'll reach out to you independently after the fact. In the meantime, that's going to conclude the webinar for today. The slide presentation and the recording of this webinar will be sent to all of the attendees later on. But the last thing I will ask is that after leaving the webinar, you're going to be prompted to complete a survey on the presentation. And we would really appreciate any feedback you may have, because it really helps us to craft and inform and improve future webinars.